Hello there, and welcome. Maybe you've had a long day, or perhaps you just like falling asleep while thinking about distant rivers and forgotten journeys rather than counting sheep. Either way, tonight's journey is for you. You don't need to do anything now but rest. Let your thoughts slow down, allow your breathing to soften, and notice your body feeling lighter as if the weight of the day has finally eased. Tonight we drift into the life of David Livingstone, the Scottish missionary and explorer whose journals mapped the Great Zambezi River and opened a window into the heart of Africa during the Victorian Age. A man driven by faith, curiosity, and an unwavering belief that he could change the world. His story unfolds along riverbanks, through fever-soaked nights, and across landscapes that had never been charted by European eyes. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, consider liking, subscribing, or sharing a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, if you're ready, let's begin. David Livingstone was born on March 19, 1813, in the small mill town of Blantyre, Scotland, situated on the banks of the River Clyde. The location was modest, a tenement building that housed the workers of Henry Monteith and Company's cotton factory. It was a place where industrial smoke mingled with the mist rolling off the river, where the clatter of machinery never quite stopped, and where families lived packed together in small rooms with little privacy and less comfort. His father, Neil Livingstone, worked as a traveling tea salesman, a job that took him door to door through Scottish villages, peddling his wares alongside Christian tracts that he distributed with equal fervor. Neil was a devout man, a Sunday school teacher and a teetotaler who believed deeply in the power of faith and education. His mother, Agnes Hunter, tended the household and raised 7 children in conditions that would test anyone's resilience. David was the second of those 7, born into a world where survival meant work, and work began early. At the age of 10, young David entered the cotton mill as a piecer. The job required him to stand for 14 hours each day, from 6 in the morning until 8 at night, tying broken cotton threads on the spinning machines. His small fingers worked quickly, his eyes strained in the dim light, and his body ached from standing in one position for so long. But even in that exhausting routine, something in David refused to be diminished. He would prop a book on the spinning frame and read while he worked, memorizing passages of Latin grammar and devouring whatever texts he could find. His fellow workers thought him peculiar, this boy who chose learning over rest, who spent his meager wages on books rather than pleasures. Yet David saw education as his pathway out, not just from the mill, but towards something greater, something he couldn't yet name but felt pulling at him like a current beneath still water. His father encouraged this hunger for knowledge, though Neil worried about David's growing interest in science. To Neil, scientific books seemed to undermine the teachings of Christianity, threatening the faith that held their family together. He tried to steer David toward theology alone, insisting that scripture was the only book a young man needed. But David's curiosity was broader and deeper. He wanted to understand the natural world, the formations of rock in nearby limestone quarries, the behavior of plants and animals, the way creation itself operated according to laws that could be observed and studied. In 1832, at the age of 19, David discovered a book that would change the trajectory of his life. It was titled Philosophy of a Future State, written by Thomas Dick, a Scottish minister and astronomer who believed that science and faith were not enemies but allies, 2 ways of understanding the same divine creation. Dick argued that the study of nature revealed the glory of God just as surely as the study of Scripture did. For David, this was a revelation. The book gave him permission, in a sense, to pursue both paths at once, to be a man of faith who also asked questions, who looked at the stars and the soil with equal wonder. Philosophy of a Future State became, apart from the Bible itself, perhaps his greatest philosophical influence, a framework that allowed him to reconcile the competing forces within him. Beyond his father's influence, David found guidance from others in the Blantyre community. Thomas Burke, a local evangelist, spoke with passion about the duty Christians had to spread the gospel to distant lands. David Hogg, his Sunday school teacher, nurtured David's spiritual development and encouraged him to think deeply about his calling. At 15, influenced by preachers like Ralph Wardlaw who denied the strict predestinarian doctrines of the Church of Scotland, David left that denomination and joined a local congregational church. Wardlaw and others preached a more open theology, one that emphasized the availability of salvation to all who sought it, rather than limiting grace to a predestined elect. This shift was significant for David. It aligned with teachings from American revivalist movements, particularly those of Charles Finney, a professor of theology at Oberlin College in Ohio. Finney taught that the Holy Spirit was open to all who asked, that salvation was not a locked door but an open invitation. For David, this meant release from the fear of eternal damnation that had haunted his childhood. It meant that his life could have purpose, that his efforts could matter, that he was not simply waiting for a predetermined fate but could actively shape his destiny through faith and action. As David matured, the monotony of mill work became not just tedious but unbearable. He had learned persistence and endurance from those long years, qualities that would serve him well in later life. He had also developed a natural empathy with all who labored, a sense of solidarity with the working poor that never left him. He used to hum lines from a Robert Burns song while he worked. "When man to man, the world over, shall brothers be for all that." The sentiment stayed with him, a belief in the fundamental equality of all human beings regardless of station or circumstance. But he knew he needed more than sympathy and endurance to fulfill the vague but insistent calling he felt stirring within him. In 1836, at the age of 23, David began attending Anderson's University in Glasgow. He studied medicine and chemistry, subjects that demanded rigor and precision. He also attended theology lectures at the Congregational Church College, where he listened to Richard Wardlaw, an anti-slavery campaigner whose words stirred David's conscience. To enter medical school, David needed knowledge of Latin, and he was tutored by a local Roman Catholic man named Daniel Gallagher, who would later become a priest and founder of St. Simon's Church in Partick. The tutoring sessions were intense, but David thrived. He worked hard, absorbed everything he could, and made lifelong friends, including Andrew Buchanan and James Young, fellow students who shared his intellectual curiosity. During this time, David also engaged with the London Missionary Society, known simply as the LMS. The Society was the major organization in Britain for missionary work, and unlike other groups, it was open to Congregationalists like David. He applied in October 1837, answering a detailed questionnaire about his faith, his education, and his motivations. The response was slow. He heard nothing for months. Then, in August 1838, he was invited to 2 interviews. The process was formal, even intimidating. David presented himself as best he could, but his manner was heavy, his speech rustic, his appearance unremarkable. The Reverend Richard Cecil, who assessed the candidates, noted that David had sense and quiet vigor, good temper, and substantial character, but he was hardly ready to proceed to full theological training. Despite these reservations, the LMS directors accepted David in June 1839, agreeing to support his continued studies. David spent the rest of that year at Ongar in Essex, receiving training in Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and theology. His tutors found him worthy but remote from brilliant, a description that might have stung less determined men but only seemed to fuel David's resolve. In 1840, David continued his medical education at the Charing Cross Hospital Medical School in London, where his courses covered medical practice, midwifery, and botany. On November 16, 1840, he qualified as a licentiate of the Faculty of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow. 4 days later, on November 20, he was ordained as a minister of the church in a service at Albion Chapel in Finsbury. The ceremony was conducted by Reverend Cecil and J. Freeman, and David stood before them not just as a doctor, not just as a minister, but as something rarer, a medical missionary, trained to heal bodies and save souls. On November 17, 1840, just days before his ordination, David Livingstone left London as a passenger on a sailing brig bound for the Cape of Good Hope. He was accompanied by 2 other LMS missionaries, William Ross, who had been ordained at the same service, and Ross's wife. The long voyage south was a time of preparation and study. David immersed himself in learning Dutch and the Swana language, both essential for work in southern Africa. The ship's captain, recognizing David's eagerness, gave him extensive tuition in navigation, teaching him how to read the stars, plot a course, and understand the movements of wind and current. These skills, learned in the quiet hours at sea, would prove invaluable in the years to come. When the ship stopped at Rio de Janeiro, most passengers stayed aboard, wary of the unfamiliar city. David, however, ventured ashore. He was impressed by the cathedral and the lush scenery, but less impressed by the drunkenness of British and American sailors in the dockside bars. In response, he distributed Christian tracts, small printed pamphlets urging temperance and faith, hoping to reach even one soul in that rowdy crowd. On March 15, 1841, the ship arrived at Simon's Bay near Cape Town. For a month, while cargo was unloaded and loaded, David stayed with Mr. and Mrs. John Philip, who served as resident director of the LMS in South Africa. Philip was a controversial figure. He held firmly to the belief that all people were equal before God and in law, a stance that led to disputes with Boers and British settlers alike. Philip argued that the Xhosa people were not to blame for the ongoing Xhosa Wars, conflicts that arose from European expansion into Xhosa territory. His views were unpopular among colonists who saw indigenous peoples as obstacles to progress. Within missionary circles, there were also tensions. Philip emphasized work among the Griqua people within the colony, while others, like Robert Moffat, advocated for pushing into new, unexplored regions beyond colonial borders. These disagreements reflected larger questions about the purpose and methods of missionary work, questions that David would grapple with throughout his career. From Simon's Bay, the ship carried David and the Rosses to Algoa Bay. From there, they began the long trek by oxcart to the Kuruman mission, a journey that took from May 19 to July 31. The Moffats, whose mission station it was, had not yet returned from Britain, so David immersed himself in Swana life, learning the language, observing customs, and beginning to understand the complexities of the cultures he hoped to serve. In September, David set out on another trek, this time with Roger Edwards, an artisan missionary who had been at Kuruman since 1830. They traveled 750 miles together, visiting a region called Mabotsa, near what is now Zeerust in South Africa's northwest province. Edwards had been instructed by Moffat to investigate the area's potential for a new mission station. The land was promising, and the local people, the Bakgatla, seemed open to interaction, though their interest in Christianity remained uncertain. In June 1843, Edwards received approval from the LMS to establish a mission at Mabotsa, and David joined him in the physical work of building facilities. It was hard labor, cutting timber, mixing mortar, raising walls under the African sun. But David thrived on it. He wrote to Arthur Tidman, the LMS secretary, saying he would be delighted to call Mabotsa the center of the sphere of his labors, but he also added that he would try to hold himself in readiness to go anywhere, provided it be forward. That phrase, provided it be forward, captured something essential about David. He was not content to settle, to build a single station and remain there for life. He wanted movement, progress, expansion into regions where no missionary had yet gone. In January 1844, the Moffats returned to South Africa, accompanied by 2 new missionary families. David rode out to meet them on the Vaal River, and for the first time, he met their daughter, Mary Moffat, who had been born and raised in Africa. Mary was intelligent, capable, and accustomed to the hardships of missionary life. She and David talked for hours during the 17 or 18 days it took the ox cart to reach Curaman. Something sparked between them, a recognition perhaps that they shared not just faith but also a resilience and determination shaped by difficult circumstances. On February 16, 1844, a dramatic event occurred that would mark David for the rest of his life. Lions had been attacking the herds belonging to the Mabotsa villagers, and David joined a group defending the livestock. He was accompanied by Mebalwe, a deacon and trusted companion. David got a clear shot at a large lion, but while he was reloading his musket, the wounded animal attacked. It seized David's left arm, crushing the bone, and forced him to the ground. David later described feeling no pain in the moment, only a dreamlike sense of shock as the lion shook him like a terrier shakes a rat. Mebalwe saved David's life by diverting the lion's attention, firing his own weapon and trying to shoot it. The lion released David and turned on Mebalwe, biting him as well. Another man tried to spear the animal but was also attacked just before it finally dropped dead. David set his own broken bone as best he could, with assistance from Edwards, but the injury was severe. The bone healed, though inexpertly, leaving his arm weakened for the rest of his life. He could never lift it higher than his shoulder, and it remained a source of chronic pain and limitation. David traveled to Curaman for recuperation, where he was cared for by Mary Moffat. During those weeks of recovery, their bond deepened, and they became engaged. On January 9, 1845, David Livingstone and Mary Moffat were married. Their union was both a personal partnership and a practical alliance. Mary understood the demands of missionary life in ways few others could, having grown up at Curaman surrounded by the rhythms of mission work and the challenges of life in the African interior. She was strong, resourceful, and willing to endure hardship for the sake of the gospel. Together, they represented a new generation of missionaries, not content to remain in established stations but eager to push into uncharted territories. However, David's time at Mabotsa was cut short. By 1845, irreconcilable differences had emerged between him and Roger Edwards. The exact nature of the conflict is not entirely clear, but it seems to have involved both personal tensions and differing approaches to missionary work. Additionally, the Bakatla people proved largely indifferent to the gospel message, a disappointment for David who had hoped to see conversions and build a thriving Christian community. In 1847, David abandoned his next mission at Shonyuane, citing drought, the encroaching presence of Boers, and his desire to move on to the regions beyond. That phrase, the regions beyond, became a kind of mantra for him, a justification for continual movement rather than sustained settlement. His next station was Kolobeng, where he experienced one of his rare successes in conversion. Chief Sechel, leader of the Bakwena people, was baptized in 1849 after 2 years of patient persuasion by David. Sechel was an intelligent man, a quick learner who mastered reading and writing in just days. He was deeply interested in Christianity, and his conversion seemed like a triumph. But only a few months later, Sechel lapsed, returning to practices that David found incompatible with Christian faith, particularly polygamy. Sechel had 5 wives, and Livingstone insisted he put away 4 of them to be considered a true Christian. This demand caused upheaval within the Bakwena community and ultimately strained the relationship between the 2 men. Sechel eventually complied, divorcing 4 wives, but later fathered a child with one of his ex-wives, an act that led David to leave Kolobeng in disappointment. Interestingly, after David departed, Sechel remained faithful to Christianity and became a missionary himself, converting much of his tribe and spreading the gospel to neighboring peoples. He is sometimes considered one of the most effective African evangelists of the 19th century, though David rarely acknowledged this later success. David Livingstone's vision for Africa was shaped not just by personal ambition but by broader currents of thought circulating in Britain during the 1840s. One of the most influential figures in his life was Robert Moffat, the veteran missionary he had met during his training in London. Moffat described to David a vast plain to the north of Bechuanaland, a region where he had sometimes seen, in the morning sun, the smoke of 1,000 villages where no missionary had ever been. That image, the smoke of 1,000 villages, haunted David. It represented countless souls living and dying without ever hearing the Christian message. It also represented opportunity, a field ripe for harvest, a frontier waiting to be opened. At the same time, David was influenced by debates about Christianity and commerce, a concept that sounds strange to modern ears but was central to Victorian missionary thinking. John Philip, the LMS missionary David had stayed with in Cape Town, published a book in 1828 called Researches in South Africa. In it, Philip argued that Christianity would always bring civilization, including free trade and free labor. This argument was reinforced by conversations with Fowell Buxton, a leading abolitionist who believed the African slave trade could be ended if African chiefs, instead of having to sell slaves, could obtain desired European goods through legitimate trade. Buxton made this case powerfully at the Exeter Hall meeting of June 1, 1840, which David attended. The idea was that Christian missions, by preaching the gospel and introducing school education, could transform African societies, making them prosperous trading partners rather than suppliers of human chattel. This concept, sometimes called commerce and Christianity, became central to David's thinking. He believed that opening trade routes into the African interior would not only spread the gospel but also undermine the economic basis of slavery. Over time, this belief would lead him away from traditional mission work and toward exploration and mapmaking, activities that seemed, to some of his colleagues, like a distraction from his true calling. Between 1849 and 1856, David Livingstone made a series of journeys that established his reputation as an explorer. In 1849, he crossed the Kalahari Desert with William Cotton Oswell and reached Lake Ngami, becoming one of the first Europeans to see the lake. The Royal Geographical Society recognized this achievement in 1850, presenting him with a chronometer watch. In August 1851, David, Mary, and their children, along with Oswell, reached the Zambezi River. David immediately recognized its potential. He hoped it would serve as a highway to the coast, a key to the interior, a navigable route that could open Central Africa to legitimate commerce. This was the beginning of his obsession with the Zambezi, a river that would dominate his life for the next decade. In 1852, after sending Mary and the children back to Britain for their safety, David set out on an epic journey. He traveled north to the village of Linianti on the Zambezi, where Chief Sekalitu of the Kololo people granted him authority to lead a joint investigation of trade routes to the coast. Accompanied by 27 Kololo warriors who served as interpreters and guides, David reached the Portuguese city of Luanda on the Atlantic coast in May 1854. The journey was harrowing. David suffered from repeated bouts of malaria, experiencing over 30 attacks, and came close to death multiple times. The route proved too difficult for future traders, so after recovering in Luanda, David retraced his steps back to Linianti. Then, with 114 Kololo men loaned by Chief Sekalitu, he set off east down the Zambezi. In November 1855, David became the first European to see a magnificent waterfall known locally as Mocio a Tunia, which means the smoke that thunders. He named it Victoria Falls after Queen Victoria. Standing on what is now called Livingstone Island, he gazed at the vast curtain of water plunging into the gorge below and wrote in his journal that scene so lovely must have been gazed upon by angels in their flight. Victoria Falls is approximately 1,708 meters wide and 108 meters high, one of the largest and most spectacular waterfalls on Earth. The mist rising from the falls can be seen from miles away, and the roar is deafening. David was awestruck, recognizing that he had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would capture the imagination of Europe when his journals were eventually published. He continued east, eventually reaching Quelimane on the Indian Ocean in May 1856, completing a transcontinental journey. For this, David became famous as the first European to cross south-central Africa at that latitude. He was hailed as having opened up Africa, though in reality, Portuguese traders had long penetrated the interior, and in 1853 and 1854, 2 Arab traders had also crossed the continent. Nonetheless, David's achievement was remarkable, and it brought him international recognition. In December 1856, David returned to Britain. The Royal Geographical Society awarded him their Patron's Medal in 1855 for his explorations in Africa. He was a celebrity now, in great demand as a public speaker. The London Missionary Society encouraged him to write up his journals, but instead of publishing through the society, David chose to work with the commercial publisher John Murray, a decision that gave him financial independence but also signaled a shift in his priorities. Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa was published in 1857 and became a best-selling travelogue. The book combined adventure narrative, scientific observation, and sympathetic descriptions of African peoples. David proposed that missions and legitimate commerce by river into Central Africa would end slave trading. His vivid accounts of the horrors he had witnessed, including scenes of slave caravans and the suffering of enslaved people, stirred public outrage and support for abolition. However, not everyone was pleased. The London Missionary Society, upon learning of David's plans for future expeditions focused more on exploration than missionary work, sent him a letter congratulating him on his journey but noting that the directors were restricted in their power of aiding plans connected only remotely with the spread of the gospel. This was a polite but firm rejection. The society wanted missionaries who would establish stations, preach, and convert. David wanted to explore, map, and open trade routes. In 1857, David resigned from the London Missionary Society. In May of that year, he was appointed as Her Majesty's Consul with a roving commission extending through Mozambique to the areas west of it. In February 1858, his area of jurisdiction was specified as the eastern coast of Africa and the independent districts in the interior. He was no longer just a missionary. He was now a government official, an explorer funded by the British Crown, tasked with investigating the commercial potential of the Zambezi River and the surrounding regions. David's dream of the Zambezi was not merely geographical. It was deeply intertwined with his religious and moral convictions. He believed that the Zambezi River could serve as a highway into the heart of Africa, a navigable route that would allow British merchants to establish trade networks, bringing European goods and Christian civilization to peoples who had been isolated for centuries. This vision was idealistic, perhaps naive. David underestimated the Zambezi's challenges, its rapids, its shifting sandbars, its seasonal floods. But he believed with all his heart that if he could prove the river navigable, he could strike a blow against the slave trade. The logic was straightforward. If African chiefs could obtain cloth, beads, guns, and other goods through legitimate trade, they would no longer need to sell their people into slavery. The demand for slaves would diminish, and the entire brutal system would collapse. This was David's grand vision, his justification for leaving mission work behind and devoting himself to exploration. He saw himself not as abandoning the gospel but as serving it in a new way, as preparing the ground for future missionaries, as creating the conditions under which Christianity could flourish. Critics, then and now, have questioned this logic. They point out that David's expeditions consumed vast resources, that his focus on geography and commerce distracted from direct evangelism, and that he made exaggerated claims about the Zambezi's navigability that led to disillusionment and failure. Some biographers, particularly Tim Giel, have argued that David consistently put his goals and career above the lives of those around him, leading to preventable deaths and suffering. There is truth in these criticisms. David was driven, obsessive, and at times reckless. He pushed himself and others to the breaking point and beyond. Yet it is also true that he was motivated by a genuine desire to end slavery, a moral clarity that, in his mind, justified extraordinary risks. David's anti-slavery convictions were not abstract. He had witnessed the horrors firsthand, and they haunted him. In his later journals, written during his 1866 to 1873 expedition to find the source of the Nile, he recorded scenes that still have the power to shock. On June 19, 1866, he wrote, "We passed a woman tied by the neck to a tree and dead. The people of the country explained that she had been unable to keep up with the other slaves in a gang, and her master had determined that she should not become anyone's property if she recovered." On June 26, he wrote, "We passed a slave woman shot or stabbed through the body and lying on the path. A group of men stood about 100 yards off. They said an Arab who passed early that morning had done it in anger at losing the price he had given for her because she was unable to walk any longer." On June 27, he wrote, "Today we came upon a man dead from starvation. One of our men wandered and found many slaves with slave sticks on, abandoned by their masters from want of food. They were too weak to be able to speak or say where they had come from." These passages reveal the depth of David's moral outrage. He concluded, to overdraw its evil is a simple impossibility. The suffering he saw was beyond exaggeration, beyond the capacity of words to fully convey. He believed that if he could open the Zambezi, if he could establish legitimate trade, he could prevent such scenes from ever happening again. On March 10, 1858, David Livingstone and his expedition team departed from Liverpool aboard the Colonial Office steamer Pearl. The expedition was far more ambitious than his previous solo journeys. The British government had provided £5,000 to investigate the potential for British trade via the Zambezi, and the Foreign Office had assembled a team of specialists to assist him. The team included David's brother, Charles Livingstone, who served as moral officer and general assistant, though his relationship with David was strained and would grow more so as the expedition progressed. There was also John Kirk, a young Scottish physician and botanist who would become one of the most important members of the expedition. Kirk was capable, observant, and meticulous in his scientific work. He kept detailed notes on the plants, animals, and geology of the regions they explored, and his collections would later be deposited in scientific institutions across Britain. Richard Thornton, a geologist, was also part of the team, as was Thomas Baines, an artist tasked with documenting the expedition visually. Baines was a talented painter, but he would later be dismissed under controversial circumstances. There were also several crew seafarers from Freetown in Sierra Leone, skilled sailors who would man the river steamer. The centerpiece of the expedition was a prefabricated iron river steamer called Ma Robert, named after Mary Livingstone, whose Swana name was Ma Robert, meaning Mother of Robert, after their eldest son. The Ma Robert was built in portable sections so it could be carried overland if necessary and reassembled. It was equipped with a small steam engine, paddle wheels, and a shallow draft designed for navigating rivers. On paper, it seemed ideal for the Zambezi. In practice, it would prove to be a disaster. The Pearl collected the crew seafarers at Freetown and reached the mouth of the Zambezi on May 14, 1858. The plan was for both ships, Pearl and Ma Robert, to ascend the river and establish bases. But almost immediately, problems emerged. The Zambezi's mouth was choked with sandbars and shifting channels. Pearl could not proceed far, and the Ma Robert struggled even in the lower reaches. The river, which David had portrayed as a highway to the interior, turned out to be far more treacherous than he had led the British government to believe. The Ma Robert's engine was underpowered, its hull too fragile for the rough conditions. It constantly ran aground on shoals, its paddle wheels fouled with debris, and its steam engine consumed enormous amounts of wood, requiring frequent stops to cut fuel. David had also failed to mention, perhaps because he had not fully explored it on his earlier journey, that the Zambezi had a series of impassable rapids called Kahora Basa. These cataracts made it completely impossible for boats to proceed upriver beyond a certain point. Pearl offloaded supplies on an island about 40 miles upstream, and from there, Ma Robert had to make repeated slow journeys, getting hauled across shoals by sheer manpower. The riverbanks were a war zone. Portuguese soldiers and their conscripted African troops were fighting against the Chikunda slave hunters led by a warlord known as Mariano, also called Matakenya. Both sides accepted the British expedition as friends, more out of indifference than goodwill, but the violence around them was a constant reminder of the instability and danger of the region. David and his team reached a settlement called Shupanga, where they established a base of sorts. But the expedition was already behind schedule, the equipment was malfunctioning, and tensions within the team were beginning to surface. David's leadership style was autocratic. He made decisions unilaterally, did not welcome input, and grew irritable when challenged. Charles Livingstone, his brother, was often at odds with him. Thomas Baines, the artist, fell out of favor and was eventually dismissed amid accusations of theft, accusations that were never proven and that Baines vehemently denied. Richard Thornton, the geologist, was also dismissed and later reinstated, a humiliating process that soured his relationship with David. John Kirk, the physician and botanist, kept his criticisms private in his diary, but they were scathing. He wrote at one point, "I can come to no other conclusion than that Dr. Livingstone is out of his mind and a most unsafe leader." This was a remarkable statement from a man who otherwise admired David's courage and determination. It suggests the level of frustration and dysfunction that plagued the expedition from its earliest days. The Zambezi expedition was supposed to be a triumph, a vindication of David's vision. Instead, it became a grueling test of endurance, a slow unraveling of hopes, and a source of lasting controversy. Yet amidst the difficulties, there were also moments of wonder, discoveries that would add to the map of Africa and expand European knowledge of the continent's geography. And central to all of it was Victoria Falls, the great waterfall David had seen 3 years earlier and to which he would return during the expedition, standing once more on the lip of that immense chasm and feeling, perhaps, the weight of all he had promised and all that was slipping away. Victoria Falls, Mosioe Tunia, the smoke that thunders, remains one of the most awe-inspiring natural features on the planet. When David Livingstone first saw it on November 16, 1855, he was traveling by canoe down the Zambezi with a group of Kololo guides. The journey to the falls had taken weeks, following the river through landscapes that shifted from open savanna to dense riverine forest. Along the way, David and his Kololo companions encountered wildlife in abundance. Elephants moved in massive herds, their tusks gleaming in the sunlight. Lions prowled the riverbanks at dusk, their roars carrying across the water. Crocodiles basked on sandbars, deceptively still until prey ventured too close. The river itself was a highway of life, supporting hippos that surfaced and submerged with explosive breaths, their territorial behavior making navigation a constant challenge. As they approached the falls, the sound grew louder, a deep, continuous roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. At first, it was merely a distant rumble, easy to mistake for thunder on the horizon. But as they paddled closer, the sound deepened and intensified, becoming a physical presence that vibrated through the canoe and resonated in their chests. The Kololo guides grew quiet, their usual banter replaced by reverent silence. They knew what lay ahead, had heard stories of Mosioe Tunia since childhood, but each visit to the falls brought the same sense of awe. Then they saw the mist, columns of vapor rising hundreds of feet into the air, visible for miles. The mist caught the afternoon sunlight and fractured it into rainbows that arced across the sky, brilliant bands of color that seemed to hang suspended above the gorge. The local people had told David about the falls, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality. No description, no matter how detailed, could convey the sheer scale and power of what he was about to witness. The Zambezi River, which at that point is over a mile wide, suddenly plunges into a narrow chasm, dropping more than 100 meters in a single curtain of water. The falls extend for approximately 1,708 meters in width, making them one of the largest sheets of falling water in the world. The force of the descent creates a perpetual mist that nourishes rainforest vegetation along the gorge, a lush green band in an otherwise dry landscape. Ferns, lianas, and towering trees thrive in this microclimate, their roots gripping the basalt rock and their canopies forming a dense green wall. David and his companions paddled to a small island on the lip of the falls, now known as Livingstone Island, where David peered over the edge into the abyss. The island was covered with vegetation, its trees leaning out over the precipice as if trying to see into the gorge below. David moved carefully to the edge, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. The roar was deafening here, a continuous thunder that made conversation impossible. The mist rose like smoke, drenching everything, turning the rock slick and the air thick with moisture. Standing on that narrow ledge of rock, David looked down into the chasm and felt his breath catch. The water fell in a single, unbroken curtain, white and furious, disappearing into a churning cauldron of foam far below. The gorge itself was narrow, perhaps 150 meters wide at most, which concentrated the immense volume of water into a violent, seething mass. Spray exploded upward in great bursts, catching the light and creating fleeting rainbows that appeared and vanished in moments. He wrote in his journal that no one can imagine the beauty of the view from anything witnessed in England. It had never been seen before by European eyes, but seen so lovely must have been gazed upon by angels in their flight. He carved his initials into a tree on the island, a gesture of claiming the moment, of marking his presence in that extraordinary place. Then he named the falls Victoria, after the reigning British monarch, Queen Victoria. It was an act of imperial appropriation, overlaying a European name onto a site that already had deep meaning for the people who lived there. Mosioe Jr., the smoke that thunders, was not just a geographical feature but a spiritual one, a place of power and reverence. By renaming it, David was asserting British dominance, claiming the falls for his culture and his queen. This act has been criticized in later years as emblematic of colonial attitudes, but David saw it as honoring his sovereign and celebrating a great discovery. Victoria Falls is extraordinary not just for its height but for its width and the volume of water that flows over it. During the flood season, the Zambezi River carries more than 500 million liters of water per minute over the edge, creating a spectacle of unimaginable power. The spray rises so high that it can be seen from 30 miles away, and the roar is audible from even farther. The chasm below the falls is narrow, only about 150 meters wide at its narrowest point, which channels the water into a violent, churning maelstrom before it flows out through a series of gorges. Over millennia, the Zambezi has carved a zigzag path through the basalt rock, creating 8 major gorges downstream from the main falls. Each gorge represents a former position of the waterfall, evidence of the river's slow but relentless erosion. When David returned to Victoria Falls during the Zambezi expedition in 1860, the experience was bittersweet. The Ma Robert had struggled to get them there, breaking down repeatedly. The expedition was already fraying. Mary Livingstone had joined David in Africa, bringing supplies and moral support, but she fell ill with malaria shortly after arriving and would die in 1862. The deaths, the failures, the broken equipment, all of it weighed on David. Standing at Victoria Falls again, he must have felt the contrast between the majesty of the natural world and the smallness of human endeavor. The falls endured, timeless and indifferent. His expedition, meanwhile, was unraveling. After leaving the immediate vicinity of Victoria Falls, David and his team attempted to navigate the upper Zambezi, the stretch of river between Victoria Falls and the Cahora Bassa Rapids. This section of the Zambezi presented its own challenges, though it was more navigable than the lower reaches downstream from Cahora Bassa. The river here flows through a landscape of floodplains, wetlands, and scattered forests, creating a complex ecosystem that changes dramatically with the seasons. During the wet season, from November to April, the Zambezi swells to enormous proportions, fed by tributaries draining the highlands of Angola and Zambia. The river floods vast areas, transforming the geography into a water world where boundaries between river and land blur into marshes and shifting channels. Villages built on higher ground become temporary islands, accessible only by canoe. The floodwaters bring nutrients that enrich the soil, making the floodplain one of the most productive agricultural regions along the entire Zambezi system. During the dry season, from May to October, the opposite occurs. The river shrinks, retreating to its main channel and exposing vast sandbars that bake hard in the sun. These sandbars become highways for wildlife, and David's journals record sightings of elephants, buffalo, and antelope crossing from one side of the river to the other. The receding waters also expose stranded fish in shrinking pools, attracting flocks of herons, storks, and fish eagles that feed in frenzy before the pools dry completely. Navigating this section required constant vigilance. The Mar Robert, with its shallow draft and underpowered engine, struggled against even moderate currents. During the wet season, the flow was too strong, and attempting to steam upstream was an exercise in futility. The boat would labor for hours, its engine wheezing, its paddles churning, barely making progress. During the dry season, the shallow water meant constant grounding on sandbars, requiring the crew to disembark and physically push the boat free. The Upper Zambezi was also home to diverse wildlife that David documented with fascination and occasionally fear. Hippos were a constant presence, massive herbivores that spend their days submerged in water and emerge at night to graze on riverbanks. Despite their seemingly docile appearance, hippos are among the most dangerous animals in Africa, fiercely territorial and quick to attack anything that threatens them or their young. David's canoes and the Mar Robert had several close encounters, hippos surfacing without warning, their enormous mouths gaping to display tusks that could crush a boat. Crocodiles lurked in the shallows, ancient predators unchanged for millions of years. David learned quickly to be cautious when approaching the river's edge, to scan the water for telltale signs of eyes and nostrils just above the surface. The Kololo guides told stories of people taken by crocodiles, dragged under in an instant, never to be seen again. Nile crocodiles can grow to over 5 meters in length and weigh more than a ton, powerful enough to drag large prey underwater and drown it. Elephants came down to the river to drink, particularly in the dry season when other water sources disappeared. David watched herds moving through the bush, their matriarchs leading the way, their young staying close. He marveled at their intelligence and social structure, noting how they cared for their sick and mourned their dead. On one occasion, the expedition encountered a lone bull elephant in Muth, a state of heightened aggression driven by surging hormones, forcing David and his companions to retreat hastily. David and his team saw herds of antelope, zebras, and buffalo grazing on the floodplains. At night, the sounds of the African wilderness filled the air. Lions roared from the darkness, their calls echoing across the water. Hyenas laughed and whooped, scavenging along the riverbanks. Leopards moved silently through the trees, and the occasional grunt of a hippo coming ashore to graze reminded everyone that the river was never truly still, never truly safe. It was a world of abundance and danger, beautiful and indifferent to human intrusion. David's interactions with the local peoples along the Upper Zambezi were complex. He was not an imperialist in the crude sense of the term. He genuinely believed in the equality of all people before God and often expressed admiration for the intelligence, dignity, and resilience of the Africans he encountered. He learned their languages, respected their customs, and sought to engage with them as partners rather than subjects. However, he was also a product of his time, and his journals contain assumptions and attitudes that modern readers find troubling. He believed European civilization was superior, that Christianity was the only true faith, and that African societies needed to be civilized and Christianized for their own good. These beliefs justified, in his mind, the disruption of traditional ways of life and the imposition of foreign values. Along the river, David observed the rhythms of daily life in villages that had existed for generations, their routines shaped by the seasons and the river's moods. He saw villages where people fished using woven traps and spears, techniques passed down through families for centuries. The traps were ingenious constructions, cone-shaped baskets woven from reeds and placed in narrow channels where fish congregated. Fishermen would wade into the water at dawn, checking their traps and retrieving the catch, which included bream, catfish, and tilapia. Women cultivated gardens of maize and vegetables on the fertile floodplain soils, planting when the waters receded and harvesting before the next flood season. Their knowledge of crop timing was precise, accumulated over generations of observation. They grew cassava, sweet potatoes, beans, and pumpkins alongside the maize, creating diverse plots that provided nutrition throughout the year. The women worked in groups, singing as they hoed the soil, their voices carrying across the fields in harmonies that seemed to emerge organically from their shared labor. Children played along the riverbanks, splashing in the shallows under the watchful eyes of older siblings and grandmothers. They swam fearlessly, their bodies brown and lean from constant activity. David noted that African children seemed healthier and more robust than many British children of the same age, a testament perhaps to outdoor life and physical activity. The children made toys from whatever materials were at hand, fashioning dolls from corn husks, balls from bundled grass, and boats from hollow reeds that they raced in the current. Elders sat in the shade discussing matters of community, resolving disputes, and passing down oral histories that stretched back through generations. David would sometimes sit with these councils, listening through interpreters, learning about the social structures and values that govern village life. He was impressed by the sophistication of their legal systems, the careful attention to fairness and precedent, the respect accorded to those who spoke with wisdom and experience. He noted the skills of local craftsmen who built canoes from single logs, massive dugouts hollowed and shaped with fire and adze. The process took weeks. First, a suitable tree was selected, usually a hardwood like muckwa or teak. The tree was felled, and the log was shaped roughly with axes. Then came the delicate work of hollowing, burning the interior in controlled fires and scraping away the charred wood. The craftsman had to judge the thickness of the walls precisely, thin enough to be light and maneuverable but thick enough to withstand the stresses of river travel. David admired the textiles woven by women on simple looms, creating patterns of geometric complexity and beauty. The cloth was made from cotton grown locally, spun into thread on drop spindles, then woven into fabric. The dyes came from plants, roots, and minerals, producing rich colors of indigo blue, rust red, and golden yellow. The finished textiles were used for clothing, blankets, and decorative hangings, and some were traded over long distances, valued for their quality and artistry. He observed pottery mold and fired in open kilns, vessels shaped by hand coils and smoothed with stones, then decorated with incised patterns before firing. The potters were invariably women, and David watched them work with fascination, their hands moving with practiced confidence, transforming lumps of clay into cooking pots, water jars, and beer vessels. The firing process was communal. Dozens of pots arranged in a carefully built wood fire that burned for hours, the potters tending the flames and adjusting the fuel to achieve the right temperature. Ironwork produced in small forges particularly caught David's attention. Blacksmiths held positions of respect in their communities, their skills essential for making tools, weapons, and ornaments. David watched them work, pumping goatskin bellows to raise the temperature of charcoal fires, heating iron until it glowed white-hot, then hammering it on stone anvils to shape hoes, axes, and spearheads. The rhythmic clanging of metal on stone became a familiar sound along the river, a percussion that marked the presence of human industry. These were not primitive people, David realized with growing respect, but skilled artisans and agriculturalists with deep knowledge of their environment. They had developed technologies and social systems adapted to their circumstances, refined over centuries of trial and learning. They raised families, celebrated harvests, mourned losses, and found meaning in their lives just as people everywhere did. David's missionary zeal never wavered. He still believed they needed Christianity, but he could not deny their humanity, their intelligence, or their accomplishments. Yet he also saw the scars of the slave trade everywhere he looked. Villages that had been raided, their populations decimated, their structures burned, their survivors traumatized and scattered. He came upon abandoned settlements where the silence was oppressive, where cooking pots lay overturned in the dirt, where the remains of hastily built barricades spoke of desperate attempts at defense that had failed. The pattern was always the same. Slave raiders, whether Arab traders from the coast or African groups working as their agents, would descend on a village at dawn or dusk, using the element of surprise to overwhelm resistance. Those who fought were killed, their bodies left as warnings. Those who fled into the bush might escape, but many did not. The captives, mostly young men and women but also children, were shackled together with wooden yokes or iron chains, forming long lines called corfles that would be marched hundreds of miles to the coast. David encountered slave caravans several times during his travels, and each encounter filled him with rage and sorrow. The lines of people shackled together, driven by slavers armed with whips and guns, were visions from a nightmare. He saw the physical condition of the captives, emaciated from inadequate food, their skin marked by sores and infections, their eyes hollow with despair. Many were yoked together at the neck with heavy wooden beams that forced them to walk in single file, heads held at unnatural angles, unable to lie down or rest comfortably. The mortality rate on these forced marches was staggering. David estimated, based on what he witnessed and what survivors told him, that for every person who reached the coast alive, several more died along the way. Some succumbed to disease or exhaustion. Others were killed when they could no longer walk, considered a loss and abandoned or shot to prevent them from becoming free. Still others died of what David called broken-heartedness, a condition he described in his journals as affecting free men who had been captured and made slaves. They would lose all will to live, refusing food, becoming listless, and dying within days even when physically they seemed capable of survival. These encounters filled David with rage and sorrow, emotions that drove him forward even when his body screamed for rest. He would sometimes intervene when he could, purchasing the freedom of individuals if he had the means, though he knew such gestures were drops in an ocean of suffering. Once, he negotiated the release of a young woman who was ill and being left behind by her captors. He paid them in cloth and beads, and the woman recovered under the care of his expedition. She eventually returned to her village, one life saved among thousands lost. The slave trade was a massive industry, its tentacles reaching from the interior of Africa to the coasts and beyond. The demand came from multiple sources. Arab and Swahili traders operated out of Zanzibar and other Indian Ocean ports, supplying slaves to markets in the Middle East, Persia, and the islands of the Indian Ocean. These traders had been active for centuries, their networks well established and protected by local rulers who profited from the trade. The Atlantic slave trade, which had transported millions of Africans to the Americas, had been officially abolished by Britain in 1807, and the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron patrolled the Atlantic coast, intercepting slave ships and freeing captives. Between 1808 and 1860, the squadron captured approximately 1,600 slave ships and freed around 150,000 Africans. Yet despite these efforts, the trade continued, driven underground perhaps but not extinguished. The East African slave trade, focused on Zanzibar, actually intensified in the mid-19th century. At its peak, some 50,000 slaves per year passed through Zanzibar city, a staggering number that represented untold suffering. The island became a major entrepot, a clearing house where captives from the interior were sold to buyers from across the Indian Ocean world. The Omani Arabs who controlled Zanzibar profited enormously, and the Sultan's palace was built on wealth extracted from human misery. David believed, perhaps naively, that the slave trade could be ended not just by military intervention or legal prohibition but by changing the economic incentives. If African chiefs could obtain cloth, beads, guns, and other goods through legitimate trade, they would no longer need to sell their people into slavery. If the interior of Africa could be opened to British merchants, if navigable rivers like the Zambezi could become highways of commerce, then slavery would become obsolete, replaced by trade in ivory, cotton, minerals, and other products. This was David's grand vision, his justification for leaving traditional mission work behind and devoting himself to exploration. He saw himself not as abandoning the gospel but as serving it in a new way, as preparing the ground for future missionaries, as creating the conditions under which Christianity could flourish. He believed that commerce, Christianity, and civilization, those three Victorian pillars, would together transform Africa and end the evils of slavery. The Mar Robert, meanwhile, continued to be a source of frustration. The iron plates of its hull were too thin, prone to leaks and damage. The steam engine was underpowered, barely able to push the boat upstream against even a moderate current. The paddle wheels were inefficient, churning the water but making slow progress. Worst of all, the boiler consumed enormous quantities of wood, forcing the crew to stop frequently to cut fuel from the riverbanks. This was exhausting, time-consuming work, and it slowed the expedition to a crawl. David had nicknamed the Mar Robert the Asthmatic, a bitter joke about its wheezing, unreliable engine. The crew, including the crew sailors, worked tirelessly to keep it operational, but there was only so much they could do. The boat was fundamentally flawed, a poor design executed with inadequate materials. It was supposed to be the expedition's lifeline, the means by which they would explore the Zambezi and prove its viability as a trade route. Instead, it became a millstone, dragging them down, breaking their spirits, and undermining David's credibility. Life along the river was a mix of routine and unpredictability. Mornings began with the difficult task of coaxing the Mar Robert's engine to life, stoking the boiler, checking for leaks, and assessing the damage from the previous day's travel. Then they would set off, chugging slowly upstream or drifting downstream, depending on the current and their destination. Meals were simple, consisting of preserved meat, biscuits, and whatever they could hunt or trade for with local communities. Game was plentiful, and John Kirk, who was an avid hunter, often provided fresh meat for the expedition. But the tropical heat was relentless, and food spoiled quickly. Dysentery and other gastrointestinal illnesses were common. Malaria was the greatest threat. Almost everyone on the expedition contracted it at some point. The fever would come in waves, chills and sweats alternating, accompanied by debilitating weakness and delirium. David had suffered from malaria many times before, and he dosed himself and others with quinine, the only effective treatment available at the time. But quinine supplies were limited, and the disease took a heavy toll. Mary Livingstone, David's wife, contracted malaria shortly after joining the expedition in 1862. She had given birth to 6 children during their marriage and had endured the hardships of missionary life in southern Africa before being sent back to Britain for safety. Her return to Africa was supposed to be a reunion, a chance to support David in his work. Instead, it became a tragedy. Mary fell ill quickly, and despite David's desperate efforts to save her, she died on April 27, 1862, at Chupanga. David was devastated. He buried her near the river, under a large baobab tree, and carved her name into the trunk. The grave still exists today, marked by a simple monument in Chupanga, Mozambique. Mary's death was a personal blow, but it also highlighted the dangers of the expedition and the high cost of David's obsession with the Zambezi. David encountered slave traders along the river, and these encounters were among the most painful and complex of his journey. The slave trade in East Africa was dominated by Arab and Swahili traders, operating out of Zanzibar and other coastal cities. They penetrated deep into the interior, establishing networks of agents and conducting raids to capture people who would then be marched to the coast and sold into bondage. Some African communities participated in the trade, either as raiders themselves or as intermediaries. The dynamics were complicated, shaped by centuries of interaction, conflict, and economic dependence. David despised the slave traders, but he also found himself dependent on them at times. They controlled the routes, knew the languages, and had the resources to travel safely. On his later expeditions, particularly his final search for the source of the Nile, David would travel with slave traders out of necessity, accepting their hospitality while condemning their profession. This moral compromise troubled him deeply, but he saw no alternative. Without their help, he could not continue his work, and he believed his work was ultimately in service of ending slavery. He witnessed scenes that he recorded in his journals with stark, unsparing detail. The woman tied to a tree, left to die because she could not keep up. The woman shot in anger because her owner considered her a loss. The emaciated men with slave sticks on their necks, abandoned to starvation. These were not abstractions for David. They were human beings, individuals whose suffering he could see and smell and hear. He wrote about them not to sensationalize but to bear witness, to create a record that might move others to action. He believed that if the British public truly understood the horrors of the slave trade, they would demand its abolition. He believed that if he could open trade routes, establish missions, and bring Christianity and commerce to the African interior, the economic incentives for slavery would disappear. This was his dream, his justification, his hope. Whether it was realistic is another question. Historians have debated whether David's approach could ever have worked, whether commerce and Christianity could truly have ended slavery without the far more direct intervention of colonial military power, and whether the colonization that followed David's expeditions was a fulfillment of his vision or a betrayal of it. These are difficult questions, and they do not have easy answers. The Mar Robert finally gave up entirely in 1860. It had been patched and repaired so many times that there was nothing left to patch. The hull was leaking, the engine was failing, and the crew had lost all confidence in it. David abandoned the boat, and the British government eventually sent a replacement, a wooden paddle survey vessel called Pioneer, which arrived in 1861. Pioneer was an improvement, but it too had limitations. It could not navigate the shallowest sections of the Zambezi, and it was still vulnerable to the rapids and shoals that plagued the river. David also commissioned a second replacement steamer, Lady Nyassa, specially designed to sail on Lake Nyassa, which he had recently discovered. Lady Nyassa was shipped out in sections and arrived in 1862, the same year Mary died. Assembling the boat, transporting it overland to the lake, and launching it were monumental tasks, but David was determined. He saw Lake Nyassa as another potential highway, a body of water that could open new regions to exploration and trade. The discovery of Lake Nyassa was one of the few genuine triumphs of the Zambezi expedition. In September 1859, David, John Kirk, and a small party ascended the Shire River, a tributary of the Zambezi that flows south out of Lake Nyassa. The Shire River was narrower and faster than the Zambezi, with dangerous rapids in several places, including the Murchison Cataracts, named after the president of the Royal Geographical Society. Despite the challenges, they reached the lake, which David named Lake Nyassa, using a local term. It is one of the Great Lakes of Africa, stretching over 350 miles in length and reaching depths of over 700 meters. The lake teemed with fish, particularly cichlids, and the surrounding regions were densely populated. David saw Lake Nyassa as another opportunity, another highway, another key to opening the interior. but the lake was also a center of the slave trade, with Zanzibar-based traders operating extensively in the region. David's exploration of Lake Nyasa brought him face to face once again with the brutal realities he had hoped to combat. The expedition to Lake Nyasa also brought David into contact with the university's mission to Central Africa, abbreviated as UMCA, a new missionary initiative inspired by David's writings and speeches. The UMCA was led by Bishop Charles Mackenzie, a dedicated and earnest man who hoped to establish a mission on the lake. David helped transport the mission party up the Shire River using the Pioneer, but the mission quickly encountered difficulties. Malaria, hostile encounters with slave traders, and logistical problems plagued the effort. Bishop Mackenzie died of fever in 1862, and the mission was eventually withdrawn. It was another disappointment for David, another example of how difficult it was to translate his vision into reality. By 1864, the British government had seen enough. The Zambezi expedition had not achieved its objectives. The river was not the highway David had promised. The trade routes had not been opened. The costs had been high, both financially and in human terms. The government ordered the recall of the expedition. David brought the ships downriver, dismantling Lady Nyasa and selling it later to help cover his debts. He returned to Britain in 1864, not as a triumphant hero but as a man whose grand vision had largely failed. The newspapers were harsh. Many described the Zambezi expedition as a disaster, a waste of resources, and a blow to David's reputation. And yet, despite the failures, the expedition had produced valuable scientific results. John Kirk, Richard Thornton, and Charles Mellor had contributed large collections of botanical, geological, and ethnographic materials to institutions across Britain. These collections expanded European knowledge of African flora, fauna, and geography. David had also mapped significant portions of the Zambezi and Shire rivers and explored Lake Nyasa in detail. His observations, recorded in thousands of pages of journals and notes, would be studied for decades. But none of that could erase the disappointment, the sense that he had promised more than he could deliver, that his obsession with the Zambezi had led him astray, that perhaps he should have remained a missionary after all. David Livingstone would not stay in Britain for long. The pull of Africa was too strong, and he still had one final obsession to pursue, the source of the Nile. But that is a story for another time, another chapter in the life of a man who could never be still, who always needed to move forward, into the regions beyond. For now, our journey along the Zambezi pauses here. You have drifted with David through his early years in Scotland, his training and ordination, his arrival in Africa, and the trials of the Zambezi expedition. You have seen Victoria Falls, navigated the upper river, witnessed the slave trade's horrors, and felt the weight of dreams deferred. Rest now, knowing that history is full of such journeys, grand visions that inspire and falter, individuals who strive against impossible odds. David Livingstone was flawed, driven, obsessive, and at times reckless. But he was also courageous, principled, and deeply committed to a cause he believed was just. His journals, filled with observations both scientific and moral, remain a testament to his complex legacy. If you enjoyed this journey, consider liking, subscribing, or sharing your thoughts. It helps others find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. The Ma Robert, named affectionately after Mary Livingstone using her Swana name meaning Mother of Robert, was supposed to be the mechanical heart of the expedition, the iron beast that would carry David and his team up the Zambezi and prove once and for all that the river was navigable, that commerce could flow along its waters, that Africa's interior could be open to legitimate trade. Instead, from almost the first day it entered the Zambezi, the Ma Robert became a symbol of everything that went wrong with the expedition, a constant source of frustration, delay, and bitter disappointment. The steamer had been built in portable sections at Laird Shipyard in Birkenhead, England, designed specifically for African river navigation. The concept was sound, The vessel could be disassembled, carried overland if necessary to bypass rapids or waterfalls, then reassembled on navigable stretches beyond the obstacles. The hull was made of thin iron plates to keep weight down, the draft was shallow to navigate sandbars and shoals, and the steam engine drove paddle wheels that could propel the boat upstream against moderate currents. On paper, it seemed ideal. In reality, almost every design choice proved flawed. The iron plates were too thin, perhaps 3/16 of an inch in some places, chosen to reduce weight but sacrificing structural integrity. The plates began leaking almost immediately, water seeping through riveted seams and around joints that had not been properly sealed. The crew spent hours each day pumping bilge water, a tedious, exhausting task that became part of the daily routine. The steam engine was underpowered for the vessel's weight and the current it needed to overcome. The boiler, which generated the steam that drove the pistons that turned the paddle wheels, was a temperamental monster that consumed enormous quantities of wood fuel. The expedition had to stop constantly to cut firewood from the riverbanks, a process that could take hours and left the crew exhausted before they even resumed travel. The wood had to be the right kind, dry enough to burn hot but not so green that it produced more smoke than steam. Finding suitable timber required scouting the banks, cutting with axes and saws, hauling the logs to the river, loading them onto the Mar Robert, and stacking them where they could be fed into the firebox. All of this in tropical heat, under skies that could shift from blazing sun to torrential rain without warning. The paddle wheels were inefficient, churning the water and creating foam but generating less propulsion than hoped. They fouled constantly on floating debris, tangled water weeds, submerged logs, anything that the river carried. Clearing the paddle wheels required someone to lean over the side, reach into the murky water, often blind to what might be lurking there, crocodiles, snakes, or simply the sharp edges of broken wood, and pull away whatever had jammed the mechanism. It was dangerous work, done repeatedly throughout each day. David had nicknamed the Mar Robert the Asthmatic, a bitter joke about its wheezing, unreliable engine that seemed to gasp for breath with each stroke of the pistons. The crew sailors from Freetown, skilled and experienced seamen, worked tirelessly to keep the vessel operational, but there was only so much even their expertise could accomplish. The boat was fundamentally flawed, a poor design executed with inadequate materials, and no amount of dedication could overcome those inherent deficiencies. The Mar Robert ran aground constantly on the Zambezi's shifting sandbars. The river, especially in the dry season, could change from day to day, channels that had been navigable one week becoming impassable the next as sand shifted and accumulated. When the boat grounded, and it did so multiple times each day, the crew had to disembark, wade into the river often waist-deep or deeper, and push the vessel free. This required coordinated effort, everyone shoving together on command, their feet slipping on the sandy bottom, their muscles straining. Sometimes poles had to be used as levers, wedged under the hull and pressed down to lift the boat enough to slide it off the sandbar. Sometimes ropes had to be run to the shore and the entire vessel winched forward by brute force. It was back-breaking labor, and it happened so often that progress up the river could be measured in miles per week rather than miles per day. The Mar Robert's failures had consequences beyond mere inconvenience. Every delay meant more exposure to disease, more days in the malarial environment of the river, more opportunities for tensions within the expedition to fester and grow. Every breakdown meant burning through supplies, food, medicine, trade goods, that had to be carefully rationed. Every setback eroded confidence, both within the team and among the British officials who had funded the expedition and were waiting for results. David had promised the government that the Zambezi was a highway to the interior. The Mar Robert struggles suggested otherwise, and that suggestion would have ramifications for David's reputation and future funding. Beyond the mechanical failures, there was also the human element, the dynamics within the expedition team that grew increasingly dysfunctional as the months wore on. David's leadership style was autocratic, demanding, and inflexible. He made decisions unilaterally, consulted no one, and bristled at any suggestion that might be construed as criticism. This approach might have worked if everything had gone according to plan, if the robot had performed as advertised, if the river had been as navigable as promised, if the goals had been quickly achieved. But when things went wrong, as they did repeatedly, David's refusal to acknowledge mistakes or adapt his approach created resentment and frustration among his subordinates. His brother, Charles Livingstone, was brought along as the expedition's moral officer and general assistant, roles that were vaguely defined and gave Charles little real authority. Charles was competent but also opinionated, and his relationship with David was strained from childhood. The two men clashed frequently, their arguments often petty but revealing deeper tensions. Charles felt undermined and disrespected. David felt that Charles questioned his judgment and authority. The conflict between them poisoned the atmosphere of the expedition and made cooperation difficult even on simple matters. Thomas Baines, the expedition's artist, was a talented and experienced illustrator who had accompanied previous explorations in southern Africa. His role was to document the journey visually, creating paintings and sketches that would accompany David's written accounts and help publicize the expedition's discoveries. Baines worked diligently, producing detailed watercolors of landscapes, wildlife, and indigenous peoples. But in 1859, accusations arose that Baines had stolen expedition supplies, specifically that he had taken goods meant for trade and used them for personal purposes. The evidence was thin, based largely on suspicions rather than proof, but David dismissed Baines from the expedition without a fair hearing. Baines protested his innocence vehemently, and later investigations suggested the accusations were unfounded, possibly motivated by jealousy or personal animosity from other team members. The dismissal left a stain on Baines's reputation, and though he was eventually vindicated, the damage had been done. David never publicly apologized, a stubbornness that reflected his broader unwillingness to admit error. Richard Thornton, the expedition's geologist, was a young and promising scientist tasked with studying the rock formations, mineral deposits, and geological history of the regions they explored. Thornton was enthusiastic and hardworking, but he was also inexperienced, and David found fault with his methods and conclusions. In 1859, David dismissed Thornton as well, ostensibly for insubordination or incompetence, though the real reason seemed to have been personal conflicts and David's impatience with anyone who did not meet his exacting standards. Thornton was later reinstated after interventions from British officials, but the humiliation of being dismissed and then brought back damaged his relationship with David irreparably. Thornton continued his geological work but with little enthusiasm, and he died of fever in 1863, one of several expedition members who would not survive to return home. John Kirk, the physician and botanist, was perhaps the most valuable member of the expedition scientifically. Kirk was meticulous in his observations, collecting thousands of plant specimens, documenting their uses by local peoples, and noting their ecological relationships. He kept detailed journals that recorded not just scientific data but also his observations of the expedition's dynamics and David's leadership. Kirk admired David's courage and determination, his willingness to endure hardships that would have broken lesser men. But Kirk also grew increasingly critical of David's decision-making, his refusal to listen to advice, his tendency to push forward regardless of conditions or the welfare of his men. In one diary entry, Kirk wrote words that have echoed through the historical assessments of the expedition: "I can come to no other conclusion than that Dr. Livingstone is out of his mind and a most unsafe leader." This was not a casual insult but a considered judgment from a man who otherwise respected David. It spoke to the level of dysfunction that had developed, the sense among the team members that they were being led by someone whose obsession with goals had eclipsed his judgment and his humanity. Daily life on the expedition was a grinding routine of heat, insects, disease, and labor. Mornings began before dawn, the crew roused by the need to make progress during the cooler hours before the sun reached its full intensity. The Ma Roberts boiler had to be fired up, a process that took time and required dry wood that had been cut and stored the previous day. While the steam built pressure, the crew ate a meager breakfast, usually hardtack biscuits, dried meat, and weak coffee or tea. Then they cast off, the paddle wheels beginning their laboured churning, the boat inching forward against the current or drifting with it depending on direction. The heat was relentless. The sun beat down from a cloudless sky, turning the iron deck of the Ma Robert into a griddle that burned bare feet and made metal tools too hot to touch without cloth wrapping. The humidity was oppressive, the air thick and still, offering no relief. Sweat soaked through clothing within minutes, attracting clouds of insects, mosquitoes, tsetse flies, black flies, biting, buzzing, maddening. The mosquitoes were vectors for malaria, and despite the use of mosquito nets at night, almost everyone on the expedition contracted the disease at some point. The fever came in cycles, chills that made teeth chatter followed by sweats that drenched bedding, accompanied by headaches, muscle aches, and a profound weakness that made even simple tasks exhausting. Quinine, the only effective treatment, was in limited supply and had to be rationed carefully. Some team members suffered attacks so severe they were delirious for days, and recovery was slow and incomplete, leaving them weakened and vulnerable to the next bout. Dysentery and other gastrointestinal diseases were also common, caused by contaminated water, spoiled food, or simply the body's inability to cope with unfamiliar microbes. The expedition's diet was monotonous and nutritionally inadequate. Preserved meat often spoiled despite being salted or tinned. Biscuits became infested with weevils. Fresh vegetables were rare, available only when they could be obtained from local villages through trade. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a constant threat, its symptoms including bleeding gums, loose teeth, and wounds that would not heal. John Kirk, as the expedition's physician, did his best to treat the sick, but his medical kit was limited, his knowledge constrained by the science of the time, and many illnesses simply had to run their course. Navigation of the Zambezi required constant vigilance and adaptation. The river was not a single channel but a network of channels, some deep and navigable, others shallow and choked with vegetation. Sandbars shifted with every flood, creating new obstacles and erasing old landmarks. The expedition often had to send scouts ahead in canoes to probe the channels, determine which were passable, and mark hazards. Even with these precautions, the Ma Robert ran aground repeatedly, each grounding requiring a laborious process of pushing, pulling, or winching the boat free. Rapids and cataracts were impassable by steamer, requiring portages where everything, the hull sections, the engine, the supplies, had to be carried overland. These portages took weeks and consumed enormous amounts of labor, hired porters, expedition members, anyone who could carry a load trudging along rough paths cut through the bush. The discovery of the Shire River in 1859 was one of the few moments of genuine excitement and optimism during the expedition. The Shire flows south out of Lake Nyasa, which David had not yet seen, and joins the Zambezi about 100 miles from the coast. David had heard reports of the river from Portuguese traders and local informants, and he was eager to explore it, hoping it might provide an alternative route into the interior, bypassing the Cahora Bassa rapids that made the main Zambezi unnavigable. In September 1859, David, John Kirk, and a small party set off up the Shire in canoes. The river was narrower than the Zambezi, swift in places, but generally navigable. The surrounding landscape was lush, green, and heavily populated. Villages lined the banks, their inhabitants curious about the strange visitors. David noted that the people along the Shire seemed prosperous, their fields well tended, their children healthy. They fished the river and traded goods with neighbors, part of a regional economy that functioned without European involvement or oversight. As the expedition ascended the Shire, they encountered the Murchison Cataracts, a series of rapids and small waterfalls that made further progress by water impossible. But David was undeterred. He organized a portage, hiring local porters to carry the canoes and supplies around the rapids. The portage around Murchison Cataracts was an undertaking that tested everyone's endurance and revealed David's ability to negotiate with and organize African laborers. The cataracts themselves were impressive, a stretch of river where the Shire drops approximately 1,200 feet over a distance of about 50 miles, tumbling through a series of narrow gorges carved into ancient volcanic rock. The water roared through these channels with tremendous force, creating rapids that ranged from merely dangerous to absolutely impassable. David studied the cataracts carefully, making sketches and measurements, trying to determine whether any section might be navigable with improved boat design or at different water levels. He concluded that the cataracts were a permanent barrier to steamboat navigation, crushing his hopes that the Shire might provide an unbroken waterway from the coast to Lake Nyassa. This was a significant setback, as one of the expedition's core objectives was to identify routes that would allow commerce to reach deep into the interior without the need for costly and labor-intensive portages. But David remained committed to exploring beyond the cataracts, believing that the lakes and rivers upstream would justify the effort. The local chiefs, initially wary of the strangers, agreed to provide porters after negotiations involving gifts of cloth, beads, and assurances that David's party meant no harm and intended only to pass through peacefully. The porters, mostly young men from villages near the cataracts, carried the expedition's equipment, including the disassembled canoes, food supplies, scientific instruments, and trade goods. David noted that these men were strong, efficient, and good-humored despite the heavy loads and the difficult terrain. They sang as they worked, rhythmic songs that coordinated their movements and lifted their spirits. David admired their physical strength and endurance, which far exceeded that of his European companions, most of whom struggled with the heat, humidity, and insects. The portage took several days, following narrow paths that climbed steep hillsides and descended into valleys before rejoining the river above the cataracts. The vegetation along these paths was thick, requiring machetes to clear the way, and the ground was often muddy or rocky, making footing treacherous. Kirk, who was lighter and more agile than David, managed the portage relatively well, collecting plant specimens along the way and marveling at the diversity of species. David, heavier and older, found the trek exhausting but pushed himself relentlessly, refusing to show weakness in front of his men. At night, they camped in clearings, fires keeping mosquitoes and wild animals at bay, and David wrote in his journal by firelight, documenting each day's progress and his observations of the landscape and people. Beyond the cataracts, the river widened and slowed, and on September 18, 1859, they reached the southern shore of Lake Nyassa, a body of water so vast that the opposite shore was not visible. David was elated. This was a significant geographical discovery, a lake that had been rumored but never confirmed by European explorers. He stood on the shore, gazing out at the expanse of water that stretched to the horizon, and felt a surge of vindication. Whatever failures and frustrations the expedition had endured, this discovery alone justified the effort and expense. He immediately began planning how to explore the lake further, how to map its shoreline, and how to investigate reports of rivers flowing into and out of it. Lake Nyassa, known today as Lake Malawi, is one of the great African lakes, approximately 360 miles long and up to 50 miles wide, making it the third largest lake in Africa by area and the ninth largest in the world. It is also one of the deepest, reaching depths of over 2,300 feet in places. The lake contains an extraordinary diversity of fish species, particularly cichlids, over 700 species, many of them endemic and found nowhere else on Earth. This biological richness made the lake a subject of intense scientific interest, and John Kirk spent days collecting specimens and documenting the species they encountered. Kirk used nets, traps, and lines to catch fish, carefully preserving them in jars of alcohol for later study back in Britain. He noted differences in coloration, body shape, and behavior among the cichlids, observations that would later contribute to understanding how species diversify and adapt to different ecological niches. The lake's water was remarkably clear near the shore, allowing Kirk to observe fish in their natural habitats, darting among rocks and submerged vegetation. He also collected mollusks, crustaceans, and aquatic insects, building a comprehensive picture of the lake's ecosystem. David, meanwhile, focused on the human geography of the lake, talking with local fishermen and traders to learn about settlements along the shores, trade routes across the water, and the political dynamics among the different peoples who lived around the lake. The shores of Lake Nyassa were densely populated, with villages and towns engaged in fishing, agriculture, and trade. The Yao people were prominent in the region, controlling much of the trade and serving as intermediaries between the interior and the coast. The Tonga people, also known as the Nyassa people, inhabited the lake's shores and islands, living in fishing communities that had existed for centuries. David was struck by the vitality and organization of these societies, which contradicted European stereotypes of Africa as primitive or chaotic. He saw sophisticated fishing techniques, including the use of large seine nets that required coordinated efforts by teams of fishermen. He observed well-built homes, granaries storing surplus maize and millet, and markets where people exchanged fish, agricultural products, pottery, iron tools, and textiles. He noted that the people around Lake Nyassa seemed healthier and more prosperous than those he had encountered along the lower Zambezi, perhaps because the lake's resources provided more reliable sustenance. But the lake was also, tragically, a major corridor for the slave trade. Arab and Swahili traders from Zanzibar had established themselves along the lake's shores, using dhows and canoes to transport captives across the water. The lake's size and the difficulty of patrolling its shores made it nearly impossible to interdict the trade, and David witnessed scenes that filled him with rage and despair. He saw canoes overloaded with captives, so many people crammed into small vessels that some were forced to stand, swaying precariously, while others were bound and lying in the bilge water. The captives, mostly women and children, looked hollow-eyed and emaciated, their bodies showing signs of abuse and malnutrition. David described one encounter where his party came upon a slave caravan on the shore, the captives yoked together by wooden forks around their necks, being driven by armed guards toward the water where canoes awaited. David confronted the slave traders, demanding they release the captives, but the traders laughed at him, pointing out that he had no authority, no military force, and no means of compelling them to do anything. David could only watch, impotent and furious, as the captives were loaded into the canoes and paddled away across the lake. He heard accounts of canoes capsizing in storms, drowning everyone aboard because the captives, shackled together, could not swim to safety. He calculated that thousands of captives were being transported across Lake Nyassa every year, part of the vast network that funneled enslaved Africans from the interior to the coast, where they were sold to Arab and Indian merchants and shipped to markets in Arabia, Persia, and India. David's writings about the slave trade around Lake Nyassa were some of his most powerful and influential, stirring public opinion in Britain and contributing to pressure on the British government to take more aggressive action against the trade. He described not just the suffering of the captives but also the economic and social devastation caused by the trade. Villages were depopulated as young adults were captured or fled to avoid capture. Fields went unplanted because there were not enough people to work them. Communities lived in constant fear of raids, unable to develop or prosper because of the perpetual threat. David argued that only by establishing legitimate trade and missionary presence in the region could the slave trade be undermined and eventually eradicated. David's exploration of Lake Nyassa also brought him into contact with the university's Mission to Central Africa, abbreviated UMCA, a new missionary initiative inspired by David's writings and public speeches. The UMCA was led by Bishop Charles Mackenzie, a Cambridge-educated clergyman who was deeply committed to bringing Christianity to Central Africa and combating the slave trade. Mackenzie and his team arrived in 1861, full of hope and zeal, and David helped transport them up the Shire River using the Pioneer, the replacement for the Ma Robert. David saw the UMCA as validation of his vision, proof that his explorations were indeed preparing the way for missionary work. But the mission quickly encountered difficulties. The region around Lake Nyassa was not the peaceful field for evangelism that Mackenzie had imagined. It was a war zone, contested by various African groups and plagued by slave raids. Mackenzie made the controversial decision to take sides in local conflicts, providing armed support to groups resisting slavers. Mackenzie's decision to arm himself and his missionaries and to actively intervene in local conflicts was unprecedented in 19th-century missionary work. Traditional missionary doctrine emphasized spiritual work and avoided political or military entanglements, the idea being that missionaries should be above the fray, neutral parties who could minister to all sides. But Mackenzie argued that neutrality in the face of the slave trade was itself a moral failing, that standing by while people were captured and enslaved made one complicit in that evil. He justified his actions by pointing to the just war tradition in Christian theology, arguing that violence in defense of the innocent was morally permissible and even obligatory. Mackenzie and his team carried rifles and participated in skirmishes against slave raiders, rescuing captives and escorting them to safety. On one occasion, they freed a group of 84 captives from a slave caravan, cutting their bonds and providing them with food and shelter. The freed captives were mostly women and children, many of them injured or ill from the brutal conditions of their captivity. Mackenzie arranged for them to return to their home villages or to settle near the mission station where they could receive protection. David initially supported Mackenzie's approach, seeing it as a pragmatic response to an urgent crisis. He had always believed that the slave trade could not be ended through moral suasion alone, that force and the establishment of legitimate authority would be necessary. But as the violence escalated and the mission became increasingly militarized, David grew uneasy. He worried that Mackenzie's actions would provoke retaliation, that the mission would become a target, and that the missionaries' primary work of evangelism and education would be overshadowed by their role as armed protectors. David also faced criticism from other missionaries and from officials back in Britain, who argued that Mackenzie had overstepped his role and compromised the mission's neutrality. The controversy surrounding Mackenzie's actions contributed to tensions within the broader missionary community and raised difficult questions about the relationship between Christianity and violence, questions that had no easy answers. This violated the traditional missionary stance of neutrality and drew criticism from some quarters, but Mackenzie felt he had no choice. How could he preach the gospel while standing by as people were enslaved? The UMCA also struggled with disease. Malaria struck the mission repeatedly, and the medical supplies were inadequate. The mission station was located in a swampy area near the Shire River, an environment ideal for mosquito breeding. The missionaries, none of whom had built up any immunity to malaria, fell ill repeatedly. They had brought quinine, the standard treatment for malaria, but their supplies were limited and they did not have enough to provide prophylactic doses that might have prevented infection. The symptoms of malaria, high fever, chills, severe headache, vomiting, became sickeningly familiar to everyone at the mission. They would see a colleague start to shiver despite the heat, see the sweat pour off them as the fever spiked, hear them moan in delirium as the disease attacked their brain. Some recovered after days or weeks of illness, weak and emaciated but alive. Others did not. The mission's doctor did what he could, administering quinine, providing fluids and nourishment, trying to keep patients cool, but without modern medical knowledge or treatments, many cases were fatal. Bishop Mackenzie himself contracted fever and died in January 1862, just months after arriving. His death was a blow to the mission and to David, who had encouraged Mackenzie to come to Africa and felt some responsibility for his fate. Mackenzie had been traveling by canoe when he fell ill, attempting to reach a village where he hoped to establish a new mission station. The fever came on suddenly, and he was too sick to continue. His companions made camp on the riverbank and tried to nurse him, but his condition deteriorated rapidly. He became delirious, speaking incoherently, and then fell into a stupor. He died on January 31, 1862, with his fellow missionaries praying over him. They buried him near the river, marking the grave with a wooden cross, a hasty funeral that reflected the grim realities of missionary work in Central Africa. David learned of Mackenzie's death weeks later and wrote in his journal about his grief and his sense of guilt. He had been so confident that his explorations would open Africa to beneficial influences, to Christianity and commerce, but those influences seemed to bring as much suffering as salvation. Other mission members also fell ill, and by 1864 the UMCA had withdrawn from the Lake Nyasa region, relocating to Zanzibar where conditions were less harsh. The UMCA's failure at Lake Nyasa was cited by critics of David's vision as evidence that he had underestimated the challenges of Central Africa, that his optimistic reports of navigable rivers and healthy climates had misled people and contributed to avoidable tragedies. David defended himself by arguing that the UMCA had chosen a poor location for their station, that they had insufficient medical supplies, and that with better planning and support the mission could have succeeded. But privately, he wrestled with doubts about whether he had been too hasty, too confident, too willing to believe that his personal experiences could be generalized to the entire region. The failure of the UMCA was another disappointment in an expedition increasingly defined by dashed hopes. Mary Livingstone's death in April 1862 was perhaps the most personal and painful loss of the entire expedition. Mary had returned to Africa at David's request, joining the expedition after years of separation during which she had remained in Britain with their children. The separation had been difficult for Mary. She had spent years managing the household alone, raising the children, coping with financial difficulties because David's salary from the London Missionary Society was modest and irregular. She had also faced social isolation, as her background as the daughter of a missionary in Africa made her somewhat of an outsider in British society. She struggled with depression and, according to some accounts, turned to alcohol to cope. When David wrote asking her to join him in Africa, she agreed, perhaps hoping that reuniting would restore their partnership and give her life renewed purpose. The reunion was supposed to be a new beginning, a chance for them to work together as they had in the early years of their marriage when they had been partners in mission work. But Mary fell ill with malaria within weeks of her arrival. The illness came on suddenly. Mary had seemed well, adapting to the heat and the basic conditions aboard the Pioneer, the new steamboat that had replaced the Ma Robert. Then one morning she complained of a headache and fatigue. By evening she had a high fever and was shivering uncontrollably. David recognized the symptoms immediately. He had seen malaria too many times to mistake it, and he began treatment with quinine. But Mary's case was severe, possibly complicated by her weakened state from years of hardship in Britain and the stress of the journey to Africa. David treated her with quinine and did everything he could to save her, but the disease progressed rapidly. She became delirious, her body racked by fever, and on April 27, 1862, at the settlement of Shupanga on the Zambezi, Mary died. In her final hours, Mary drifted in and out of consciousness. David sat beside her, holding her hand, speaking to her even when it was unclear whether she could hear him. He told her that she would recover, that they would continue their work together, words meant as much to comfort himself as her. But Mary's breathing became labored, her pulse weak and irregular. Kirk, who was present, later wrote that David remained composed outwardly but that his distress was evident in his face and voice. Mary's last coherent words, according to David's journal, were a prayer, asking God to have mercy and to care for her children. David was devastated. He had lost his partner, the mother of his children, the woman who had endured hardship alongside him and never complained. He buried her under a large baobab tree near the river, carving her name and the date into the trunk. The funeral was simple, attended by the expedition members and a few local residents who had known Mary during her brief time in Africa. David read from the Bible and led prayers, his voice breaking as he committed Mary's body to the earth. The grave still exists today, marked by a memorial in Chupanga, Mozambique, a quiet testament to a life spent in service and cut short by the very diseases David had hoped to help African peoples overcome. Mary's death cast a shadow over the remainder of the expedition. David withdrew into himself, becoming even more taciturn and difficult. He drove the team harder, perhaps trying to outrun his grief, perhaps feeling that only by achieving his goals could he justify the sacrifices Mary and others had made. The journals from this period show a man struggling to process his loss while maintaining his public role as expedition leader. He wrote private passages about Mary, reminiscing about their early years together, expressing regret for the time they had spent apart, questioning whether he had made the right choices in prioritizing his mission over his family. But the harder he pushed, the more the expedition struggled. The scientific work continued, however, and this became one of the expedition's lasting contributions. John Kirk's botanical collections were extensive and valuable. He collected thousands of plant specimens, pressing them carefully, labeling them with locations and dates, and noting their uses by local peoples. Some plants were medicinal, used to treat fevers, wounds, or digestive ailments. Others were sources of food, fiber, or dye. Kirk documented the ecological relationships he observed, noting which plants grew in which environments, which were associated with specific soil types or water conditions, and which were cultivated versus wild. His specimens were eventually sent back to Britain, where they were studied by botanists at Kew Gardens and other institutions. Many species were new to science, and some were named in Kirk's honor. Richard Thornton, despite his difficult relationship with David, also made significant contributions as a geologist. He examined rock formations along the Zambezi and Shire rivers, identifying sedimentary layers, volcanic intrusions, and fossil deposits that helped piece together the geological history of the region. He took samples of minerals, noting the presence of coal, copper, gold, and other resources that might have commercial value. His work laid the groundwork for future geological surveys and mining operations, though he would not live to see those developments. Charles Livingstone, David's brother, made ethnographic observations, documenting the languages, customs, and social structures of the peoples they encountered. He took notes on marriage customs, inheritance practices, religious beliefs, and political organization. His observations were not always systematically organized, and his interpretations were colored by Victorian biases, but they provided a record of societies that would soon be transformed by colonization. David himself, despite his many roles as leader, navigator, and diplomat, also kept meticulous journals. He recorded daily events, geographical features, astronomical observations for determining latitude and longitude, and his own reflections on the moral and practical challenges of the expedition. His journals, later published in various forms, became primary sources for historians studying both the geography of Central Africa and the mindset of Victorian explorers. By 1864, it was clear to the British government that the Zambezi expedition had failed to achieve its primary objectives. The river was not the navigable highway David had promised. The trade routes had not been opened. The commercial potential he had touted had not materialized. The costs had been enormous, both financially and in human terms. Mary Livingstone was dead, Bishop Mackenzie was dead, Richard Thornton would die of fever in April 1863, and numerous African porters and crew members had also perished from disease, accidents, or conflicts. The Ma Robert had been abandoned, scrapped after its final breakdown, a rusting hulk left to the elements. Pioneer and Lady Nyassa remained operational, but they too were costly to maintain and operate. In February 1864, the Foreign Office ordered the recall of the expedition. David received the news with a mixture of relief and bitterness. He knew the expedition had not succeeded, but he also believed that with more time, more resources, more support, the objectives could still be achieved. He felt abandoned by the British government, betrayed by officials who had never fully understood or appreciated the difficulties he faced. He brought the ships downriver, dismantling Lady Nyassa and eventually selling it to help cover debts. The return journey was melancholy, a procession of failure through landscapes that had witnessed so much struggle. David arrived back in Britain in 1864, not as a triumphant hero but as a man whose grand vision had faltered. The newspapers were harsh, describing the expedition as a disaster and a waste of resources. Some critics questioned whether David had deliberately exaggerated the Zambezi's navigability to secure funding, whether he had put his own ambitions above the welfare of his team, and whether his obsession with exploration had distracted him from his true calling as a missionary. These criticisms hurt, but David defended himself vigorously. He argued that the scientific results were valuable, that the geographical knowledge gained was significant, and that the expedition had exposed the horrors of the slave trade and galvanized British public opinion against it. There was truth in these defenses. The expedition had produced substantial scientific collections. David had mapped significant portions of the Zambezi, Shire, and the shores of Lake Nyassa, filling in blank spaces on European maps. His accounts of the slave trade, particularly the vivid descriptions in his journals, had indeed stirred public outrage and contributed to pressure on the British government to take stronger action against the East African slave trade. In 1873, under British pressure, the Sultan of Zanzibar officially closed the slave market, a direct result of the public awareness that figures like David had helped create. Yet the personal costs were undeniable. David had lost his wife, strained his relationships with colleagues, and spent years in a grueling environment that aged him prematurely. He returned to Britain exhausted, his body weakened by repeated bouts of malaria, his arms still painful from the long-ago lion attack, his spirit battered by the weight of unfulfilled promises. But David Livingstone could not stay still. Within months, he was planning his next expedition, this time to search for the source of the Nile, a quest that would consume the final decade of his life and lead to his death in the interior of Africa in 1873. That journey, and the famous meeting with Henry Morton Stanley, who found him at Ujiji in 1871 with the words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume," is another story. But the legacy of the Zambezi expedition lived on, shaping perceptions of Africa, influencing missionary strategies, and contributing to the scientific understanding of a continent that Europe was only beginning to explore systematically. The legacy of David Livingstone's journals, particularly those from the Zambezi expedition, extends far beyond the geographical and scientific data they contained. They became cultural artifacts, texts that shaped how generations of British and European readers understood Africa, its peoples, its landscapes, and its place in the world. Published in various forms, Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa in 1857, Narrative of an Expedition to the Zambezi and its Tributaries in 1865, and posthumously The Last Journals of David Livingstone in 1874, these writings reached vast audiences. Missionary Travels alone sold over 70,000 copies, an enormous number for the time, and made David a household name across Britain. The journals were written in a style that combined scientific observation with adventure narrative, moral reflection with ethnographic detail. David had a gift for vivid description, and his accounts of Victoria Falls, the wildlife of the Zambezi, and the encounters with diverse African peoples brought the continent to life for readers who would never see it themselves. He did not romanticize Africa, describing its hardships honestly, the diseases, the dangers, the difficulties, but he also portrayed it with respect, acknowledging the humanity and complexity of its inhabitants. This was significant. Much of the European writing about Africa in the 19th century was dismissive or outright racist, portraying Africans as savages in need of civilization. David, while certainly a product of his time and holding many of the paternalistic attitudes common among Victorian missionaries, nonetheless insisted on the fundamental equality of all people before God. He praised the intelligence, skill, and dignity of the Africans he met, and he condemned the slave trade in unsparing terms, making clear that the blame lay not with Africans as a whole but with specific traders, both African and Arab, who profited from human suffering. His journals also served a political purpose, intentionally or not. They provided justification for British involvement in Africa, framing it as a moral imperative to end slavery and bring civilization, defined in Victorian terms as Christianity, commerce, and British legal and social systems. This framing contributed to the ideological foundation for the scramble for Africa, the late 19th century rush by European powers to colonize the continent. Between 1881 and 1914, almost all of Africa was carved up and claimed by European nations, with borders drawn on maps in European capitals, often with little regard for existing ethnic, linguistic, or political boundaries. David did not live to see this scramble, dying in 1873, but his writings and his vision of opening Africa to commerce and Christianity were cited by colonial advocates as justification for their projects. This aspect of his legacy is deeply controversial. Modern historians and African scholars have critiqued the ways in which exploration narratives like David's contributed to colonial ideologies, erasing or diminishing African agency, portraying the continent as empty and waiting to be discovered, and justifying European domination as benevolent intervention. Yet it is also important to recognize that David's motivations were complex. He genuinely opposed slavery and dedicated his life to fighting it. He genuinely believed that Christianity offered spiritual salvation and practical benefits to those who accepted it. He did not advocate for military conquest or violent subjugation, though the colonial projects that followed often employed both. The gap between David's vision and the reality of colonialism is a reminder that intentions and outcomes do not always align, that even noble goals can be co-opted for less noble purposes. The scientific legacy of the Zambezi expedition is more straightforwardly positive. John Kirk's botanical collections enriched European understanding of African flora and contributed to the development of botany as a science. His specimens were studied, classified, and compared with plants from other regions, helping to trace evolutionary relationships and ecological patterns. Richard Thornton's geological observations helped establish the basic structure of Central African geology, identifying coal seams, mineral deposits, and fossil beds that would be explored more thoroughly in later decades. David's geographical observations, including his maps of the Zambezi, Shire, and Lake Nyasa, corrected errors on existing maps and provided navigational information for subsequent travelers. His astronomical observations, used to calculate latitude and longitude, were remarkably accurate given the instruments and conditions. The expedition also contributed to ethnographic knowledge, documenting languages, customs, and social structures that would soon be disrupted by colonization. Charles Livingstone's notes, David's own observations, and John Kirk's interactions with local peoples created a record of African societies at a moment of transition, before the full impact of European colonization transformed the region. These records, despite their biases and limitations, are valuable historical sources, used by anthropologists and historians to reconstruct the past. David Livingstone died on May 1, 1873, in Chief Chitambo's village in present-day Zambia. He had been searching for the source of the Nile, driven by the same restless energy that had propelled him through the Zambezi expedition and all his earlier travels. He died of malaria and internal bleeding from dysentery, illnesses that had plagued him for years and finally overwhelmed his weakened body. His faithful companions, Chuma and Susie, removed his heart and buried it under a tree near the spot where he died, then carried his body over 1,000 miles to the coast so it could be returned to Britain. That journey, which took 63 days and demonstrated extraordinary loyalty and determination, became part of the Livingstone legend. David's body was eventually shipped to Britain and buried with great ceremony in Westminster Abbey, the national church where monarchs are crowned and the most distinguished Britons are interred. The inscription on his tomb reads, "Brought by faithful hands over land and sea, here rests David Livingstone, missionary, traveler, philanthropist." For 30 years his life was spent in an unwearied effort to evangelize the native races, to explore the undiscovered secrets, and abolish the desolating slave trade of Central Africa. Those words capture how David was remembered by his contemporaries, as a hero, a martyr, a man who gave his life for noble causes. Over time, however, the assessment has become more nuanced. Modern biographers, particularly Tim Gill in his comprehensive and critical biography published in 1973 and revised in 2013, have examined David's life with less reverence and more scrutiny. They have highlighted his failures as a leader, his mistreatment of colleagues, his exaggerations about the Zambezi's navigability, and his tendency to prioritize his goals over the welfare of those around him. They have also placed his life in the broader context of colonialism, examining how his explorations, however well-intentioned, contributed to the dispossession and subjugation of African peoples. Yet even critical assessments acknowledge David's courage, his endurance, and his genuine moral commitment to ending slavery. He was a flawed man, driven by a complex mix of faith, ambition, and a need to prove himself. He achieved remarkable things, crossing continents, mapping rivers, documenting cultures, and drawing attention to injustices. But he also caused harm, to his family, to his colleagues, and inadvertently to the African peoples whose lands he helped open to European exploitation. The journals remain, thousands of pages of handwritten observations, now preserved in archives and accessible to researchers through digitization projects like Livingstone Online. They are windows into a mind both brilliant and obsessive, into an era when the world was being mapped and catalogued with unprecedented intensity, and into the early encounters between European and African societies that would shape the modern world. They are also testaments to endurance, to the human capacity to keep moving forward even when every rational calculation suggests stopping, to keep believing in a vision even when reality repeatedly contradicts it. David Livingstone mapped the Zambezi not just on paper but in the imagination of his era. He turned a river in Central Africa into a symbol of possibility and challenge, a place where commerce and Christianity might together transform a continent. The reality proved far more complicated, far more tragic, and far less amenable to grand visions. But the attempt mattered, the records mattered, and the man, for all his flaws, mattered. His journals sit in archives now, their pages yellowed, their ink fading, but the words still legible, still telling a story of ambition and struggle, of hope and disappointment, of a river that refused to be tamed and a man who refused to give up. The physical journals themselves are remarkable artifacts. Some are bound volumes, leather covers worn smooth by handling, the pages filled with David's cramped handwriting, words running margin to conserve precious paper. Others are loose sheets, water-stained and fragmentary, rescued from the conditions that destroyed so much else. David wrote in pencil when ink was unavailable, and some passages have faded to near illegibility, requiring modern conservation techniques and multispectral imaging to recover the text. The journals contain more than narrative. There are sketches, rough maps drawn from observation and astronomical calculation, diagrams of geological formations, and botanical specimens pressed between pages. There are tables of latitude and longitude readings, meteorological observations recording temperatures, rainfall, and wind directions, and ethnographic notes documenting languages with phonetic spellings and vocabulary lists. David recorded everything, driven by a compulsion to document that went beyond scientific necessity. It was as if by writing everything down, by fixing it in ink on paper, he could impose order on the chaos around him, could prove that his efforts had meaning and purpose. The journals also reveal his inner life in ways that his published books, edited and sanitized for public consumption, do not. There are moments of doubt, rare but present, when David questioned whether he had made the right choices, whether his vision was achievable, whether the costs were justified. There are expressions of grief after Mary's death, passages where his composure breaks and the pain bleeds through. There are also moments of wonder and joy, descriptions of sunsets over the Zambezi, encounters with wildlife that left him breathless, interactions with African peoples who showed him kindness when he had no right to expect it. The full complexity of the man emerges from these pages, a complexity that neither hagiography nor criticism alone can capture. The impact of David Livingstone's work extended far beyond his lifetime, shaping British and European attitudes toward Africa for generations. His writings contributed to a narrative of Africa as the Dark Continent, a term that was already in use but that gained wider currency through exploration literature. The phrase suggested a place of mystery and danger, but also opportunity, a blank space on the map waiting to be filled in by European knowledge and ambition. This narrative erased the long histories and complex societies of African peoples, treating the continent as if it were empty or primitive, as if European arrival marked the beginning of real history. Modern scholars have critiqued this perspective extensively, showing how it served colonial ideologies by justifying European intervention and domination. David did not create these attitudes single-handedly, but his writings reinforced them, and his reputation as a heroic explorer contributed to the cultural climate that made colonialism seem not just acceptable but noble. Yet it is also important to recognize that attitudes toward David within Africa itself are not uniformly negative. In Zambia, the country named after the Zambezi River he explored, David is still remembered, and the town of Livingstone near Victoria Falls bears his name. The Livingstone Museum there houses artifacts from his expeditions and educates visitors about his life and work. Some African historians and commentators view David more favorably than their Western counterparts, recognizing his opposition to slavery, his relatively respectful treatment of African peoples compared to other Europeans of his era, and his willingness to live alongside Africans rather than in isolated colonial enclaves. This does not excuse his role in opening Africa to colonization, but it complicates the narrative, reminding us that historical figures can be both admired and criticized, that their legacies are contested and multifaceted. The missionary work that David inspired continued long after his death, evolving and adapting to changing circumstances. The university's mission to Central Africa, despite its initial failures at Lake Nyasa, relocated and eventually established successful mission stations in Zanzibar and mainland Tanzania. These missions focused not just on evangelism but also on education and healthcare, building schools and hospitals that served local populations. The Scottish Missionary Societies, inspired by David's example and his Scottish heritage, sent numerous missionaries to Central Africa throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Livingstonia Mission, founded in 1875 and named in David's honor, became one of the most significant missionary enterprises in Malawi, establishing schools, hospitals, and churches that remain active today. These missions had complex legacies. They brought literacy and Western education to regions that had relied on oral tradition, creating new opportunities for some Africans but also disrupting traditional knowledge systems and cultural practices. They provided medical care, introducing treatments for diseases like malaria and smallpox that saved lives, but also brought a paternalistic attitude that dismissed African healing practices and medicinal knowledge as superstition. They preached Christianity and built communities of converts, but often at the cost of undermining indigenous religions and social structures. The relationship between missionary work and colonialism was always ambiguous. Missionaries sometimes opposed colonial authorities when those authorities exploited African peoples too egregiously, advocating for better treatment and protections. But missionaries also collaborated with colonial governments, accepting funding and protection, and their educational work often served to train Africans for subordinate roles in colonial economies and administrations. the vision of transforming Africa through Christianity and commerce that David championed became entangled with imperialism in ways he might not have anticipated but that were perhaps inevitable given the power dynamics of the era. The geographical knowledge that David contributed, particularly his mapping of the Zambezi, Shire River, and Lake Nyasa, had lasting scientific value. His observations corrected errors on existing European maps, which before his expedition showed the interior of southern Africa as largely blank with speculative features drawn from rumor and guesswork. David's maps, based on careful astronomical observations and systematic traverses, provided reliable information about the courses of rivers, the locations of lakes, and the elevations of various regions. Later explorers and surveyors built on his work, refining the maps further and filling in additional details. By the early 20th century, the geography of Africa was well understood by European standards, and much of that understanding traced back to pioneers like David. The hydrography of the Zambezi system, the complex network of rivers, wetlands, and lakes that David explored, became subjects of ongoing scientific study. Geographers and hydrologists examined the river's flow patterns, its seasonal variations, and its role in the broader ecosystem. Engineers eventually built dams on the Zambezi, most notably the Kariba Dam completed in 1959, creating Lake Kariba, one of the world's largest artificial lakes. These projects transformed the river in ways David could never have imagined, harnessing it for hydroelectric power and irrigation but also displacing tens of thousands of people and altering the ecology of the entire river system. Whether David would have approved of such interventions is unknowable. He sought to open the river to commerce, but he also expressed reverence for its natural beauty and power. The tension between development and conservation, between utilitarian exploitation and aesthetic preservation, is one that his era was only beginning to grapple with, and it remains unresolved today. David Livingstone's personal failings, particularly his treatment of his family, add another dimension to his legacy. His wife Mary endured years of hardship, giving birth to 6 children under difficult conditions, often left alone to care for them while David traveled. Their eldest son, Robert, grew estranged from his father and died fighting for the Union Army in the American Civil War under an assumed name, a tragedy that David learned of only belatedly. His daughter Agnes later wrote about the pain of growing up with an absent father who seemed to care more about Africa than about his own children. David himself expressed regret in his later years, writing that his one regret in life was that he did not spend enough time with his children. This admission is poignant, an acknowledgement of a cost that cannot be recovered, of relationships sacrificed to ambition. It reminds us that explorers and adventurers, for all their achievements, often leave behind personal wreckage, families fractured by absence and neglect. The Victorian cult of the hero explorer, which lionized men like David while glossing over such personal costs, has been interrogated and dismantled by more recent scholarship that insists on seeing the whole person, not just the public achievements. The question of how to remember David Livingstone, how to teach his story and assess his legacy, remains contentious. In Britain, he was long taught as an unambiguous hero, a model of Victorian virtue, courage, and Christian commitment. Statues of him stand in Edinburgh, Glasgow, and London, and his birthplace in Blantyre is a museum dedicated to his life. But as Britain has grappled with its imperial past, particularly in the wake of decolonization and the rise of post-colonial studies, these commemorations have become sites of debate. Some argue that David's role in opening Africa to colonization makes him complicit in the violence and exploitation that followed, and that celebrating him uncritically perpetuates a problematic narrative of European superiority and benevolence. Others argue that David's motivations were genuine, his opposition to slavery was real, and that judging him by modern standards is anachronistic and unfair. This debate is not unique to David. It is part of a broader reckoning with how societies remember historical figures who embody both the ideals and the flaws of their times. In educational contexts, David's story is increasingly taught with nuance, acknowledging both his achievements and his limitations, his courage and his blindness to the consequences of his actions. This approach seeks to avoid both hagiography and condemnation, recognizing that historical figures are products of their contexts but also agents with moral responsibilities. It asks students to think critically about the past, to question narratives, and to consider multiple perspectives. David Livingstone's journals, in this framework, become not just sources of geographical and scientific information but also texts that reveal the complexities of 19th-century imperialism, the intersections of religion and politics, and the personal costs of grand ambitions. The Zambezi itself, the river that so consumed David's energies and imagination, continues to flow through 6 countries: Zambia, Angola, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique, supporting millions of people who depend on its waters for agriculture, fishing, drinking water, and transportation. The river's ecosystems are rich and biodiverse, home to hundreds of species of fish, birds, mammals, and plants. But the Zambezi also faces modern challenges: pollution from agricultural runoff and mining, overfishing, habitat destruction, and the impacts of climate change, which are altering rainfall patterns and river flows. Conservation efforts seek to protect the river and its wildlife, but these efforts must navigate complex political, economic, and social realities. The countries through which the Zambezi flows have different priorities and capacities, and coordinating management of a transboundary river is challenging. David's dream of the Zambezi as a highway of commerce has, in some ways, been realized. The river supports navigation in certain sections, and the dams provide electricity that powers industries and homes. But the dream of legitimate commerce ending slavery and transforming societies proved far more complicated than he imagined. Commerce came, but so did exploitation. Christianity spread, but so did cultural disruption. The Zambezi remains both a life-giving artery and a contested resource, a place of beauty and conflict, much as it was in David's time. The legacy of exploration is similarly ambiguous. Exploration expanded human knowledge, filled in maps, and connected distant parts of the world. But it also facilitated conquest, extraction, and the imposition of foreign systems on indigenous peoples. David Livingstone stands at the intersection of these contradictions, a man who genuinely believed he was doing good but whose actions contributed to harm, a man who documented Africa while simultaneously helping to make it vulnerable to European domination. To understand his legacy is to grapple with these contradictions, to resist simple judgments and to recognize that history is rarely a story of heroes and villains but of flawed human beings acting within systems larger than themselves. The Zambezi expedition, for all its failures, was an attempt to realize a vision. The vision was flawed, shaped by Victorian assumptions about race, religion, and progress that we now reject. But the effort was real, the suffering was real, and the consequences were real. The journals document all of this, and they remain valuable not despite their limitations but because of them. They show us how people thought in another time, how they justified their actions, what they valued, and what they overlooked. They are uncomfortable documents in many ways, filled with attitudes that modern readers find offensive or disturbing. But they are also vivid and human, showing a man wrestling with enormous challenges, trying to make sense of a world that constantly defied his expectations, and ultimately failing to achieve what he set out to do but succeeding in ways he did not anticipate. The geographical knowledge, the scientific collections, the exposure of slavery's horrors, all of these had lasting impacts, even as the grand vision of transforming Africa through commerce and Christianity proved elusive and problematic. If you've stayed with us through this journey into David Livingstone's life and the Zambezi expedition, thank you. It's a story that doesn't offer easy lessons or clear heroes, but it offers something perhaps more valuable, a chance to see history in its complexity, to understand how individuals and larger forces interact, how good intentions can have unintended consequences, and how the past continues to shape the present. If you enjoyed this exploration, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. What struck you most about David Livingstone's story? Do you see him as a hero, a flawed man, or something in between? Your engagement helps others find these stories and keeps the conversation going. Until next time, rest well, and may your dreams be filled with rivers that flow and journeys that lead somewhere meaningful.